Again, we don't want arrows pointing at our nipples. That's not what we're going for. Hello, knitting friends. Welcome back to Maybe a Better Wanna Knits. I am your host, Kristen, and today we are taking a deep dive into bust darts. So, what are they? How do you know if you need them? And if you do need them, how do you add them to your garment? So, if that sounds like it will be of interest to you, grab a whip or something to drink, and let's dive in. All right, knitting friends, as I said, today we are talking about bust darts. So bust darts are a common feature of sewn garments, dresses, and shirts. Generally speaking, when those garments are made with woven fabrics, because woven fabrics do not have a lot of stretch. They are a frequent feature in sewing patterns, but they've only more recently begun to become more common in knitting patterns. So I thought it would be great to take a look at this topic today because I know that there's a lot of information kind of spread out here and there. And it's just a topic that I think would be helpful if we bring it all together, all of the different questions and facets of it into one video. That said, I will specifically today be talking about horizontal bust darts. Let's start with the big question. What are bust darts? So in simple language, bust darts are extra fabric added into the front of your garment to make room for your boobs. And commercially produced knit fabric has a lot of stretch because it is knit at such a fine gauge. It is also frequently made out of stretchy materials. Knit fabric, again, commercially produced, generally stretches enough. They don't really need bust darts. But when we are talking about handmade knit fabric, it does have some stretch, but not always enough. And that is where the bust darts come in. So I do have some notes here. And as I said, I'm only going to be talking about horizontal bust darts, which are the kind that add length to your fabric underneath the bust. Knit fabric, particularly stockinette, does have some stretch. But if you have a larger bust, and we'll get into this a little bit more, of course, it may stretch that fabric so far out and out, so in both those dimensions, that the remaining fabric below will start to ride up in the front. It will start to curve upward because your breast tissue is causing the fabric to stretch beyond kind of its normal built-in stretch. And I want to do a quick demonstration of sort of this basic principle with my dress form. So let's hop over there for a second. Okay, so for this demonstration, I have just a piece of thread, yarn, that I'm going to fold exactly in half. Okay, and then right here at the halfway point, I have put a little dot so we can watch what happens. I'm going to put that dot right here at the shoulder line. And then we're going to drape the yarn as if it were a sweater over my dress form. So you can see here's the front, and this part of the yarn is kind of sticking out, of course. It's draped over the bust is pointing out, so it's pushing that fabric forward a little bit. And in this case, it's pushing the yarn forward. So let's see what happens when we go down to the base of the dress form. And now you can see that this end of the yarn is significantly higher up than this end of the yarn. And so that is what's happening with our sweaters. The breasts are pushing the fabric out. It's not naturally going to curve under there. It's going to stick out, and that's going to take up some of the length. And so then we put the garment on and it starts to ride up in the front. All right, so now you can see what I'm talking about when I'm saying that the fabric in the front of your garment may begin to ride up when the fabric of your garment is being stretched beyond sort of its general capacity. And so we are creating with horizontal bust darts a kind of wedge of fabric. It's kind of like a little bit of a trapezoid shape that is going to fill in from under your bust and out to the sides to create the extra fabric that is needed to cover the full bust so that your garment doesn't start riding up in the front. So what we want to do with our bust dart is to create a wedge of fabric from here to here and out to the side to curve under this fullest part of the bust. So instead of just pushing the fabric out, we're going to create extra fabric that's going to curve under here. But we don't want it to start curving right at this point. We want it to be just under. And then it's going to start curving down. So we're going to create this amount of fabric length to cover the under part of the bust, and then to taper out to the sides. And that is what's going to be the bust dart. Very briefly, vertical bust darts also exist. I'm not going to be talking about them today. I think horizontal bust darts are the more common type. They're also kind of the more, at least I think, the more intuitive type. They're easier to kind of grasp what you're doing. And so we're going to be focusing on those. But vertical bust darts add width at the front of the fabric rather than length. And this always makes me think of like a princess seam in a sewn garment. So you're kind of curving the fabric outward in the bust area. So who needs bust darts? So there's not like a tried and true answer here. There's no specific rules. A lot of knitters are certainly just kind of going to learn by experience. They notice that their garments are riding up significantly in the front. And they don't like it. They try bust darts. They find out that that is the solution. I'm going to give you sort of a general guideline, but again, it's not a hard and fast rule. If you think you need bust darts, even though you don't meet these requirements, you can try bust darts. So as I said, there are some measurements that may offer some guidance. So some designers will recommend you are going to take your high bust measurement, which is up here above the full bust, and your full bust measurement. And if the difference between those is X number of inches or centimeters or more, you may find bust darts helpful. Some designers say 2 inches. Some designers say 3 inches. But like I said, there's no specific rules. Throughout the rest of this video, what I'm going to be using are Amy Scher's guidelines. So she's really done a lot of great work on bust darts, on making well-fitting garments, and I will definitely include the link to her content in the description box so that you can check that out if you're looking for more information. But her guideline is basically measuring your front and back length from your neck to just under the bust, which is, I will say, a little tricky to do if you are kind of working on your own, not as easy as measuring your high bust and full bust, because you got to kind of like measure down here. And essentially, though, her guidance is if the difference between the measurement from here to just under your bust and from here to that same point on your back is more than 2 inches, you will benefit from bust darts. So some differences I've mentioned so far is 2 inches or 3 inches. I will say it seems like most designers go more toward the 2-inch mark. And again, the reason for that is because knit fabric is naturally stretchy, especially stockinette. So if your difference is less than 2 inches, the natural stretch of the fabric is probably going to accommodate that relatively easily and won't have a significant impact on the length of your garment in the front. However, if the difference is more than 2 inches, that's where sort of the fail point of the knit fabric and its ability to stretch becomes relevant, and at that point, you may need these bust darts. However, all of that said, all of those measurements, etc., it's worth considering that there are other factors at play. So, the closer fitting your garment is or is intended to be, the more likely you are to need bust darts with a lower difference between those numbers, whether it's the length or the upper bust versus full bust. If a garment is designed to be very close fitting, that means it's already kind of utilizing the natural stretch of the fabric. So if it's supposed to be 0 or negative ease, that has already been taken into consideration in the pattern. So if you still want your garment to be just as close fitting, but also don't want it riding up in the front, you may need to incorporate bust darts with a smaller difference in your numbers. Also, the fabric, stockinette stretches more than cables. Lace stretches more than stockinette. And finally, the intended fit of your garment, if it's already very oversized, you won't have to worry about this as much. So if the fit of your garment is recommended is 6 to 10 inches of positive ease, this is not really going to be as much of a factor unless the difference in your measurements is much greater. So as you can see, exactly when you need bust darts depends on a fair number of different factors. It's very individual, and your fabric and your garment ease and your garment style and construct are all going to impact that. As a general rule of thumb, the closer fitting your garment is, the greater the difference between your either upper bust and full bust, or the length from neck to under bust is, the more likely you are to need bust darts. The more oversized your garment is, the smaller the difference in those measurements is, the less likely you are. But you will have to kind of look at, each individual garment you are planning to knit to determine whether you really need bust darts or not. All right, before we get into how to create bust darts, let's talk about one last thing, which is size. How do bust darts impact the size of the garment you are knitting? People who do have a larger chest are maybe picking a larger size. To accommodate that, the addition of bust darts might change that. As with everything else that we already talked about, though, it's going to be a very individual decision based on both your body and the pattern that you are knitting. So what's really going to be key here is looking at all of the measurements in whatever pattern you're looking at. So not just the bust, but all of the other measurements as well. So if all of the measurements for the size 2 would fit you, but you're going to knit a size 5 because of your full bust measurement, then yes, in that case, adding bust darts that are correctly calculated means you're going to be able to, in general, knit a smaller size garment. You're not going to need to knit a size 5. However, considerable number of patterns are graded with a 4-inch difference between sizes. So, in many cases, even adding the bust darts is not going to impact the size that you should knit unless that difference between your measurements is more significant, because there's already 4 inches of difference between each size, at least for the full bust. So if you're only including bust darts to accommodate for an inch or 2, your overall size is probably not going to change. With all of this information, if you have determined that you need bust darts for whatever pattern you're working on, and it probably doesn't include them because, again, this is sort of a newer development in the knitting pattern industry, how do you add them yourself? What is the information you need? How are you going to calculate them? Where are you going to put them in the garment? There's a lot of questions, no doubt, that you have about bust dart placement and math. So we are going to get into that. And I do have a project that I'm able to demonstrate this on. Fortunately, it's not finished because knit in a fingering weight yarn on a US2 needle, and it's taking a long time, but I have done the whole bust dart thing. I've done all the math so that I can at least show you that part, even though the garment isn't finished yet. So we will get into that. So if you want to add bust darts to a garment, ideally that garment is going to be in stockinette, at least in the bust area, and it's going to be worked from the top down. That is going to be the easiest way to place your bust darts where they need to go. So again, we want to create a wedge of fabric that is going to curve around the lower part of the bust. And so the easiest way to figure out where that should go is to be able to try our garment on and say, okay, I've reached the part where now I need that wedge of fabric, and then to put them in. You can do it working from the bottom up, but as with most bottom up garments, it's a lot trickier to figure out where things are going to go on the body, because it is so hard to basically try on a tube of fabric with nothing to hold it up and see how it's fitting your body. So you can, but it is tricky. Regardless, what we want from our bust dart is for it to start just under the fullest part of the bust and to taper out to the sides, almost to the underarm, but not quite. So again, you got a little trapezoid kind of here that's going to go like this. So this part here, not actually your nipples. You don't want it pointing at your nipples. You want your bust dart to start just outside and below. If you're working from the top down, start. If you're working from the bottom up, finish. But it should be outside and below the apex points, usually your nipples, of your breasts. Again, we don't want arrows pointing at our nipples. That's not what we're going for. And again, the ideal way to determine this point is to be able to try our garment on. So if you are doing this, I definitely suggest you have already done at least the collar of whatever it is you're working on. Ideally, some of the sleeves, because that's going to pull the armholes up. Once you pick up for the sleeves, you don't have to finish both sleeves, but maybe a little bit of a pickup around the sleeves to pull your armholes up, and a steam block, if not a wet block, so that you get the closest thing to the actual fit of your finished garment that you can get before it's actually finished, to make sure that you're getting the right spot. The other thing that is key is that whatever you usually wear under your sweater or top, tank, whatever it is what you would normally wear. So if you would normally wear a bra, when you're getting ready to do this, wear a bra. If you would normally wear a bra and an undershirt, if you would normally wear a sports bra, whatever you kind of normally wear, that's what you should be wearing, both when you take your measurements and when you are determining the point at which to start your bust darts. Because, most undergarments are going to pull your boobs up and in a little bit. And so we want to get those points correct. So whatever you normally wear with your sweaters, that's what you should be wearing. So you've reached the spot where you want to start your bust darts. Now you have to do some math. I'm so sorry. I know. But it's measuring, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It's not calculus. You can do this. You just need a calculator and a tape measure. So the shortest part of your short rows is going to be, as I said, just outside and below the points of your breasts. So what you need to know is what that measurement is, the points between the measurement that is the points between your breasts. And I'm going to include a link in the description box from Heather Storta, who has all of these calculations written down for you so that you don't have to try to memorize what I'm saying. That wouldn't be very helpful. But basically, so you're going to measure the points of your breasts. You're going to add 1.5 inches to that. That's going to take us just outside the points of the breasts. And then you're going to multiply that by your stitches per inch, your gauge. And that's going to give you the number of stitches that should be in your shortest row. Then you're going to take the number of stitches that are in your whole front of your sweater. You can just count this one. You don't have to do any math. You're going to subtract 2 inches worth of stitches from that number, because again, we don't want the dart to go all the way to the underarm. It's going to go, like right outside. So we're going to take about 1 inch away on either side, and that's going to be your longest row, and you should know the number of stitches that are in that row. You are going to subtract your shortest row from your longest row, and then you're going to divide that by 2. That's the number of stitches on either side of that shortest row, so the number between the shortest and the longest on this side, and that's the number of stitches you're going to work your short rows over. And then finally, you're going to use your row gauge and determine how many rows total you need in your trapezoid of fabric. And then that's the number of short rows you need to work. Total, the total number of rows you need back and forth in that trapezoid shape, worked over those stitches on either side. And so the number of short rows you have to work is going to determine how many stitches are in between each of your short row turns. So, of course, if you haven't worked short rows before, this might sound pretty scary. It's really not. And again, I'm going to link you to Heather Storda's calculations so you can get a better look at the numbers. But that is essentially it. You're going to find your shortest row, you're going to find your longest row. The difference between them, divided on either side of your boobs, is where you're going to work the short rows, and then how often you're going to turn. So are you going to turn 2 stitches past your last short row, 1 stitch, no stitches in between? That's going to depend on that total length of fabric and your gauge. This sounds pretty abstract as I'm just talking about it, but I'm going to help you out here, maybe, by walking you through what I did with my project. So this is my still unfinished Pi Camisole, which is a very close-fitting garment. And I went ahead and added bust darts. Come on, focus. There you go. Right there. That is the dart that I put in. So you can see it stretches from this point out to here, and it creates this trapezoid of fabric. So I'm going to walk you through the measurements that I took for this and the math that I did. I don't have it memorized though, so here we go. I will not be appearing on YouTube in my underwear. So you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you the results of measuring myself for this process. As I said, I'm using Amy Scher's guidance, which means I took the measurements from neck to under bust, both front and back. And the difference between those measurements was 3 inches, which, for what it's worth, is about the same difference between my high bust and full bust. And that may or may not be the case with you, but that was the case for me. So either way I had checked, I probably still would have been like, yeah, I need bust darts. As I said in the beginning, the recommendation is that you take this measurement and you subtract 2 inches for the natural stretch of the fabric. And then whatever you have left, if anything, is going to be the length of that you want to add in the front of your garment. So if I did that, it would have been 3 inches minus 2 inches is just 1 inch. However, because this garment is so close fitting, I only subtracted 1 inch. I wanted to add 2 inches of length to the front because it is a negative ease garment. Based on my gauge, for a 2-inch bust dart, I need to add 22 rows of fabric, which means 11 pairs of short rows. The width of my shortest row needed to be 8.5 inches. That's 68 stitches. And the width of my longest row should be 124 stitches. So I'm going to subtract short from long. That leaves me with 56 stitches. I'm going to divide that in 2 for a set of stitches to work my short rows over on either side. So I'm going to be working my short rows over 28 stitches. I need 11 pairs of short rows. So that means I need 11 wrapped stitches on either side. Unfortunately, that means I need to put 1.5 stitches between each turn so that, each short row should be 1.5 stitches longer than the previous one. That doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is what I have done, and I'm going to show you, is I started out by putting just 1 stitch in between each turn and then increased to 2 stitches to balance out, so it works out to be about 1.5 stitches. So without further ado, I will put my Pi Camisole clips in here and give you a look at this process. All right, so here is, cover up my belly, the Pi Camisole as it stands, and you can see it's falling much lower in the back than it is here. So unfortunately, I have already knit past the point where I would have to add the bust darts, but it's just stockinette, so I will go ahead and rip it back, and then we will put the bust darts in and see how it goes. All right, friends, so here we have the garment that I'm going to be demonstrating the bust darts on. This is my Pi Camisole. Presumably I just included the video originally trying it on without the bust darts. And so now I'm just going to show you how I'm set up to do this, and then I'm going to show you the results. So this is the front half of my stitches, I hope. Indeed it is. And I have just worked over to my side marker. So obviously bust darts were just working on the front part of the garment. And so I have worked out all of the math for this, and then I have put some markers in. You may or may not choose to do this. If you're doing bust darts, it's going to be helpful visual for this video. It's probably not super necessary. So we start out with the stitches that are not going to be involved, and that's these first inch worth of stitches over here. Okay, so I don't want our dart to come all the way into the underarm, and this is the underarm center, so we don't want the dart to come all the way in here. So this right here, these are the first stitches that will not be involved in the short row. And then these stitches, and unfortunately I have to cram all of these stitches onto a needle that is too small because this is being knit on a US 2, sadly, which doesn't have interchangeables. These stitches between these 2 points are marking the shortest row. So this is essentially the points of the breasts, a little outside that. Okay, you don't want, so we already talked about how the dart is starting a little bit below the fullest part of the bust. So you don't want the dart like pointing, you know, directly at your nipples. That's not what we're doing. So we've gone a little bit past the fullest part of the bust, and we're a little bit outside with our shortest row. And that leaves these stitches on the sides where we're going to actually be working the short rows. So that means that I'm going to work my first row by knitting across here. I'm going to stop here. I'll probably be doing German short rows. I'm going to make the double stitch and turn, work back here, make the double stitch and turn, and then I'm going to continue working each row a little bit longer until I get to here. Now you can do the math to figure out the exact number of stitches in between your turns. For me, it's 1.5, which is not a great number to have in between. So I will probably start by working 1 stitch in between, and then closer to the end, the longest row, I'll put 2 stitches in between until I get to here. This is the longest stitch. I will work the last short row turn here and then do that on the other side. And what that is essentially doing, so here, as I said, there's a little squishy, but here's the center points, here's the point of the dart. And so we're going to be going a little bit longer, and that's going to create this wedge of fabric that goes from here to here. Adding that length just below the bust so that as the fabric is pushed forward at that point, it has some extra length here that would then curve under and around the bust. So that is essentially it. Once you're done, you've worked your longest row, then you'll come back, work across, you know, whatever. If you're doing wrap and turn, you resolve the wraps. If you're doing short rows, you work every double stitch as a single stitch, and then we're back to the beginning of the round and we're working in the round again. So I am going to go ahead and do that, and it's going to take me a while because again, I'm doing this on a US 2 needle, but I'm going to go ahead, work my dart, come back and show you, and then I will do another try on so you can see how this works. Wish me luck. Okay friends, I have finished, adding the bust darts. So here is the front of my Pi Camisole, and here is what we've got. So all of this fabric from here down over to the end of the dart over here. This is all additional fabric that is going to fill in underneath the bust. So you can see this would be the fullest part of the bust here, and then this will curve under it and taper out to the side. So I have used German short rows, and of course this is unblocked. It will look a little bit more even after blocking, but it will also, you know, create sort of a decorative element, if you will. So you can see the dart ends right about here. It doesn't reach all the way into the underarm, and you're just getting this extra fabric. All right, I'm trying to mostly avoid appearing in YouTube in my underwear. But now you can see with the bust dart in here. So here's the dart, it goes up here, it's just under and outside the fullest part of the bust. It's not all the way up in the middle, that's not where we want it. We're trying to create this fabric to go over and under the bust, and now the back and the front are matching lengths at this point under the bust. So as I said, my Pi Camisole is still not done, but what you can kind of see now is that the front is actually longer than the back. And that is because we've got this extra, come on, like I said, it's all bunched up here. We've got this extra boob fabric so that when it is worn and some boobs are in here, they are the same, more or less, length. I'm not going to be able to finish this by the time this video is published, but I will, now that I swear, I watched an entire movie knitting this, and still, I've only got like 3 inches from the underarm. It is slow going, but I'll try to get one more try on in here so you can see how this is working. Well, I have put bust darts in at least one other garment. This is the first time I've tried to calculate them myself. I think it went pretty well. I don't know for sure because the garment is not done, and at the rate I'm going, it's never going to be done. But it was certainly a learning experience. I am at the point with my measurements where definitely I would like bust darts for closer fitting garments. Oversized garments with a lot, 6-8 inches of ease, definitely not necessary, but for something like this, something that is negative or 0 ease, I definitely think that they work for me. You may have a different experience. So, all right, friends, that is all I have for you today in our deep dive into bust darts. If you have additional questions, do please leave a comment. I will try to respond to comments, or if there are enough additional questions, maybe we do a part 2 somewhere along the way. Again, I will link to both Amy Scher and Heather Storda's information and calculations on bust darts, so you can take a look at those and maybe start adding some bust darts to your own garments. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you found it educational or useful, I hope that you will give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. New knitting videos here every Saturday. If you're looking for me on social media, you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as Media Peruana, and I will see you soon in another video.